Good morning, brothers and sisters. So, Galatians chapter 4 gives us some clues as to God's appointed times regarding the rapture, regarding the fullness of time and God's timetable when the exact religious, cultural, and political conditions demanded by his perfect plan were in place. Jesus came into the world the first time. Galatians 4 says this, "But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons." Now, regarding the fullness of the time that had come, God is sovereign over every event in time and eternity. When the time came, it was the time predetermined by the will of God the Father from eternity past. He came the first time in the fullness of time, and he will return in the fullness of time the second time. Why was the time full? Well, several events converged by God's providential working. Number one, the Roman civilization had brought peace and a road system, also known as the Pax Romana. Number two, the Grecian civilization provided a language. Number three, Jews proclaimed monotheism and a messianic hope in the synagogues of the Mediterranean world. There was a remnant of Jewish men and women who anticipated the time was at hand. They looked for redemption in Jerusalem. Luke chapter 2, verse 25, Simeon continually looking with earnest expectation for the consolation of Israel, their Messiah. Sadly, most of the chosen people did not recognize the fullness of time as documented by Luke in Luke 19, verse 44. They did not recognize the time, the Greek word kairos, from which we get our word chronology, of your visitation. So it is today, brothers and sisters. There is nothing new under the sun. We have a remnant within the church who are anticipating the rapture of the church. But sadly, most of the church doesn't know what time it is on God's prophetic clock. As there were a few watching for the Messiah the first time he came, so it is the second time he comes. Warren Wiersbe quotes, "Historians tell us that the Roman world was in great expectation, waiting for a deliverer at the time when Jesus was born. The old religions were dying. The old philosophies were empty and powerless to change men's lives. Strange new mystery religions were invading the empire. Religious bankruptcy and spiritual hunger were everywhere. God was preparing the world for the arrival of his Son. Just as the conditions were ripe for Jesus to come into the world as a man, die on the cross, fulfilling prophecies regarding his crucifixion, torture, death, and resurrection, so it will be in these last days regarding fulfilling the plan of God to rapture his church before Jacob's trouble." Let's look at a few prophecies in the Old Testament about Jesus' first coming that show God's fullness of time. His timing is perfect. Isaiah 53 verse 9 says this, And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was deceit found in his mouth." This particular prophecy speaks to his crucifixion as a common criminal, also known as making his grave with the wicked, and his burial in the tomb regarding the rich at his death. Jesus being born into the Roman Empire at the time of crucifixion was God's appointed time. So let's take a look at the conditions that will meet the second coming of Christ on God's timetable. What things need to be in place for the opportune time for the rapture of the church and the beginning of the tribulation period? Number one, we need to see the formation for the conditions of a 7-year tribulation talked about in Matthew 24. Do we see deception, wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom? Is there famines, pestilences, earthquakes in various places? Yes, we are seeing this on a massive scale. These are the beginnings of sorrows. Number two, we also need to see a worldwide system being built for the Antichrist known as the fourth kingdom in Daniel chapter 7. Do we see this now? Yes, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, the European Union, amongst other organizations, are helping to lay this foundation for the Antichrist to rule over the entire earth. Number 3, we also need to see the technology in place for the mark of the beast. This was something no other generation of Christians could say for certain was ready to go. Do we see this in place now? Absolutely. Since the 2020 pandemic, we have watched this system being implemented along with China's social credit score are paving the way for the mark of the beast technology being ready in the 7-year tribulation period. Number 4, we also need to see Israel established back in her land and ready to build a temple to implement sacrifices for their false Messiah. Do we see this now? Yes. In fulfillment of the prophecy, Israel has become a nation in May of 1948. So, going back to Galatians chapter 4, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. Let's paraphrase this particular verse for our present time. But when the fullness of time had come, the Matthew 24 signs, the tribulation shadows, God sent his Son into the world to rescue his church out of the world. Maranatha, saints.